Okay, this meeting is now being recorded. Thank you for joining me. Let me close my invitation bar. This is a presentation, a comparison of culture, diversity, and equity problems of practice across the world, as presented by Crystal Castel. We're going to be looking at 3 countries with one goal in mind. We're discussing poverty and family assets and how they relate to student scores and testing throughout the United States, Ireland, and Australia. First, we'll start with a brief history on the United States of America. The United States has a history of racial segregation, which has been embedded throughout the country across every aspect of our culture. This includes education. Our students were segregated racially until 1954, when we began the process of desegregation with the ruling in Brown versus Board of Education. The ruling in Brown versus Board of Education was that racial segregation of schools was unconstitutional of um, regardless of the resources being equal. Students were no longer allowed to be separated by race. There are many unintended consequences of this ruling, and subsequent laws were created to promote equity and diversity in school, such as the ESEA and the Emergency School Aid Act. As a result of the desegregation of schools, many teachers and school administrators of color were released from their duties. So there was a significant loss of qualified Black educators and school administrators in order to prevent educators and administrators of color being in a position above educators or administrators or even students who were white. In 2007, there was another case that was brought before the Supreme Court regarding racial segregation, and this was the parents involved in community schools versus the Seattle School District. This case was interesting because the Seattle School District was assigning students within their district to schools according to their race to create racially balanced schools within their district. Now, this was a procedure that had been put in place in school districts in Mississippi to desegregate schools. Because there was no history of segregation in Seattle school districts, this was not necessary, but it was voluntarily created in an effort to, like I said, create these racially balanced schools within their district. This was falsely creating this racial balance. And the parents actually began the procedures of suing the school district because students were being denied access to schools of their choice that they were applying to because of their race, because quotas were met, or they needed to assign students to a different school because it put things out of balance. The Supreme Court overturned the lower court ruling, which ruled in favor of the school district based on the procedures put in place for the schools in Mississippi. But the Supreme Court overruled those rulings and ruled that the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race, and that the district would need to determine admission to public schools on a non-racial basis. This is significant because, like I said, racial segregation is embedded throughout the history of the United States. The next country we're looking at is Ireland. Ireland is a country rich with history. Historically, Ireland was a country which many people had emigrated from, and few were choosing to immigrate to. Over the years, this has changed, and the non-national immigrants are now exceeding the Irish immigrants who are returning to Ireland. Ireland is also home to several refugees, though most immigrants in Ireland are harder to visually discern, only because they are typically of white European descent, immigrating to a traditionally white country of Ireland. So this is harder to decipher as compared to Latinos and Black Americans throughout America. There is another group who tends to be segregated, and these are the travelers. They tend to stick to themselves within their communities. Um, but the travelers have been part of Ireland and that community for a very long time. Um, Ireland also has several forms of segregation throughout their education. Um, Based on kind of avoiding the differences. So in order to hide the differences, because Ireland historically did not value um, multiculturalism and really just wanted to present as one united front, Catholic Irish people. Um, so students with disabilities were segregated and went to special schools. Travelers, as teenagers, were segregated into training centers. Girls were educated separately from boys, and different religious groups are still educated separately. So there are designated schools um, for the Muslim community and various religious schools around the country. In order to address the changing climate throughout Ireland, because of the increased immigration, and in response to attending the World Conference Against Racism in 2001, Ireland committed to creating a national action plan against racism. One of the components of this plan included creating an intercultural education strategy. This was put into place in 2010 and was enacted from 2010 to 2015. But there was an overall trend that policy of what was supposed to be done and procedure of what actually was done remained very different, deeming the policy ineffective. Ireland does have a significant asset in a reduced socioeconomic status difference as far as test results for students, which we'll discuss on a later slide. Australia is the next country we're looking at. Australia is broken into several territories, and within these territories, there are several different languages spoken. Australia is a multicultural country with a variety of languages. There is several different dialects spoken by Indigenous and Aboriginal people, though the adopted language of the country is English, and 72% of the country identifies that they speak English at home as well. There was a significant increase in students from non-English homes, documented from 2008 to 2022. And in the article from SBS News, which covered this, it was found that in 2008, many Aboriginal and Indigenous children who have English as a second, third, or even fourth language, due to that significant number of different languages spoken throughout the territories, were being reported and registered as Australian and English speaking rather than Indigenous or Aboriginal. This was due to limited options for registering and reporting cultural heritage, as well as other reasons associated with racism and views of Aboriginal and Indigenous people. Australia also has documented significant social segregation. OECD's PISA results from 2015 ranks Australia at among the highest rate of social segregation in schools, ranking them number 8 out of 71. The segregation of students is made more prominent by school choices such as religious schools and satellite Indigenous-only campuses. Australia has a variety of school choices, including private schools, religious schools, satellite campuses, neighborhood schools, and really just with the many options for schools, they found that the segregation was increased rather than decreased. School performance based on socioeconomic status. Here we can look at the OECD average, which disadvantaged students scored an average of 431, and advantaged students scored an average of 525. Australia, you see these numbers are slightly higher on both. So the advantaged students in Australia scored 532 average as opposed to 525, and the disadvantaged students scored 439. The difference is the OECD average has a gap between the two, the advantaged students and disadvantaged students, of only 93 points, and Australia's gap is 101 points. So though the advantaged students have achieved higher, it means the disparity between advantaged and disadvantaged students is bigger. United States has a similar gap of 102 points between the advantaged and disadvantaged students, with a score of 420.7 compared to 522.7. Ireland has the smallest gap documented here, with a score of only 74 points between the lowest and highest quarters. The lowest quarter of disadvantaged students, lowest quarter socioeconomic status, scored 456.7, and their highest quarter scoring 530. So these are both above the OECD average scores with a smaller gap between the two. Divided cities. This is part of the reason that we see this socioeconomic divide. Divided cities occur which exacerbate the social and racial segregation of students. They occur and create gaps and barriers that produce exclusive spaces and concentrations of disadvantage. So that's when you see the wealthy neighborhoods, high-rise buildings of apartments in New York that we know are significantly more expensive than other neighborhoods that we would view as the ghetto, more or less. As you drive through cities, it is usually pretty apparent where the wealth within that city live. There's higher taxes, higher property taxes within those areas. And families tend to move where they can afford. These more advantaged families rather, tend to pick housing that falls within zoning for schools that they would like their children to attend. But when this is influenced by budget and what type of housing a family can afford, this creates that income segregation where students are grouped together in lower income apartments. And now you have a dense population created within the city of disadvantaged students. The logical way to combat this type of segregation in neighborhood schools is to allow parents' choice schools, which which allows parents to choose where their children attend school. More than 2/3 of the OECD countries increased parent choice options following the same thought process in an attempt to create a more inclusive educational environment, and the results were not what was intended. This is not necessarily due to the failure of school choice as an option to promote equality, but rather an indicator of inefficiencies and inconsistencies in the current school choice plans being used. Magnet schools in the southern states were created with this same philosophy and ultimately increased segregation rather than decreasing it. Private schools and funding in Australia are increasing that disparity between the advantaged and disadvantaged students, because private schools that are collecting funding are also collecting federal funds and creating an excess of funding of $4 to $6 billion, which could be reallocated in a more equitable manner to support the more disadvantaged students in Australia. In Ireland, you see parents' choice schools in a manner of religious schools and parents being able to choose. Um, and unfortunately, these are um, advantaged parents being able to choose where they send their children to school. In order to reframe this and promote parents' choice for equity, I would recommend that we follow Ireland's model. We have seen that Ireland has a decreased gap between their socioeconomically advantaged and disadvantaged students. This is because they have increased supports at DEIS schools. Ireland's model reduced class sizes and increased resources in the DEIS schools, the disadvantaged schools, increasing funding and allowing students to have a higher quality education. By combining the two models of parents' choice and Ireland's model of reduced class sizes and increased resources, we can level the playing field. One of the reasons this is necessary is in a similar approach to the special education classrooms. You have a classroom of the students with the highest needs. You also have to have the smallest class sizes to appropriately differentiate instruction and accommodate each student in the classroom. We know that socioeconomically disadvantaged students have an increased amount of trauma, increased stressors, and increased life experiences that others don't necessarily relate to. Having targeted training for the staff in these situations, in these classrooms environments, as well as reduce class sizes so that the staff can more easily meet the needs of the students within these social classes, will increase equality or equity in education across the board. Equitable funding, such as reallocating the excess funding through Australia of that $4 to $6 billion in a more equitable manner to support the disadvantaged students, increasing funding and staff in these more disadvantaged schools will promote a higher quality education across the board. Parents' choice comes into play here because as parents if parents had the opportunity to choose where their students went to school within the district and transportation was provided, which levels that playing field of equity, because part of the reason our disadvantaged students cannot always choose what school they attend is because of that transportation cost. And and stability. We know that parents look at class sizes. We know that parents look at test scores as well as growth in the school environment at each school. By increasing the funding and the supports at these to the students who need it most, we will increase their test scores and increase the production of these students, leveling that playing field and decreasing the gap between our socioeconomically advantaged and disadvantaged students. This means that the parents will be able to choose where their students go to school, but they won't have to look, and it will be much safer to send their students to whatever neighborhood school they are in, reducing the socioeconomic divide and increasing that idealistic multicultural education that all of our students would thrive in, that inclusive environment for all of them. But it really comes down to just meeting their needs through that reduced class size and looking at the level of need of the students rather than just what their test scores result. Thank you so much for joining me tonight.